On February 14, 1929, police officers raided a trucking warehouse known to be the headquarters of George "Bugs" Moran, the recently anointed leader of the North Side Gang after the previous two head honchos were murdered. Curiously, the officers lined 7 men, including Moran's minions and an optometrist, against a wall, opened fire, and killed them all. The officers were members of the Chicago Outfits, Al Capone's notorious gang. None of them were ever identified. Here is what their lives were like. In the early 1900s, Sicilian and Italian immigrants started various extortion rackets in New York City, Chicago, and other major centers in the U.S. Before long, these outfits converged under the name Black Hands for their distinctive practice. Members would send threatening notes to the well-off with an imprint of their inked black hand. The gang frequently locked horns with police. In a case of a particularly aggressive retaliation by the police, many members were shot, arrested, or deported. The gang soon changed its name to Chicago Outfits, or the Chicago Family, and shifted focus from kidnappings and extortion to bootlegging and gambling. The scattered outfits also solidified under a main boss, the Godfather, who was advised by a consigliere, and handled an army of soldiers and associates who brought in money for the gang. The gang was perennially deadly, but it became a global cult with its most notorious and ruthless leader, Al Scarface Capone. When Al Capone became the leader of the gang, he already had quite a long history of crime. At 14, he left school after hitting a teacher and getting into sprawls in various boys' gangs. Soon, his reputation had gotten him a job as the bouncer at a Coney Island bar owned by the mobster Frankie Yale. It was here that he earned the gashes on his cheek that earned him the nickname he reviled, Scarface. Although Al Capone brushed them off as war scars, he had never gone to Vietnam. In reality, they were from the time he insulted a female patron, something her brother did not take lightly. Around 1919, he moved to Chicago. Some say Scarface had murdered a rival gang member and feared retribution. Others say that his mentor Giovanna Papa Johnny Torrio had joined the Chicago Outfits and called him there. It was here that Al Capone's fortunes rose. He had a long list of illicit business, from gambling to prostitution, from racketeering to bootlegging, bringing him in around $100 million a year in the 1920s. The larger-than-life figure thought of himself less as a criminal and more a philanthrope. In his view, if people were fond of gambling or drinking, he should furnish them with what they want. Public attention was drawn to his exuberant style, his candidness in front of camera, and his supposed generosity. When he was presented at a court in 1931, crowds blocked the streets to catch a glimpse of the kingpin. Scattered incidents, however, showed just the kind of cold-blooded killer that lay beneath this veneer. In the Valentine's Day Massacre, 7 men were murdered in broad daylight, and such was Al Capone's influence that not a single man was ever convicted. The sole witness has never recounted a single word. As for the man himself, he was in Miami at the time, and as he maintained, completely unaware. When Rica fled to the U.S. at the age of 23, he was not an outsider to the world of crime. In his native Naples, he had killed 1 man, maybe at the order of the mafia, maybe because he broke his engagement with Rica's sister, then killed the one whose testimony had sent Rica to jail. Clearly, this patient man was not given to the flashiness or bursts of anger so typical of his companions. In the U.S., he had worked with a number of gangs by the time he met Al Capone. In his first meeting, he managed to save Scarface's life by alerting him to the presence and weapons of rival gang members, even sustaining a gunshot in his right shoulder. As a later case would show, there is nothing more valuable in the underworld than loyalty. Al Capone became so close to the colleague that he was even Rica's best man. In 1943, in the biggest disaster the gang had to face, Rica was given a sentence of 10 years. The gang saves its own, though, and its influence made sure that Rica was out within 3 years. From then, he kept his distance from crime and was convicted only once for tax evasion. Now, granted, Fred Burke was less a member of the gang and more an associate, but it was his outsized roles in Al Capone's criminal activities that illustrate the might of Al Capone's The Outfits. Burke unlike Al Capone, was not someone fated for a life of crime. He was a regular Sunday school attendee and did exceptionally well at school, but he came from poverty. At 17, he fell in with people running a bogus land scheme and fled his native Kansas to avoid persecution. He ended up in Missouri, where he fell in with some gangs. Then in the war, then back to Missouri, and twice in jail. Soon, he was involved in robberies and contract killings. Around 1927, he fled Missouri after murdering 3 men and found Al Capone. Al Capone gave him his most important assignment to date: get rid of Scarface's rival, Moran. Legend has it Fred Killer Burke partnered with the police, who also had scores to settle with Moran. The group raided Moran's headquarters, killing 7 men, not one of which was Moran himself. He fled to Michigan, changed his name to Frederick Dane, and was never convicted of the crime. Nitti was Al Capone's right-hand man. They were cousins, so there was an unbreakable tie there. The man known as the Enforcer was also Al Capone's underboss and a trusted advisor. Nitti's attraction to the criminal world was natural. First was, of course, the proximity. When he moved to the U.S. at the age of 7, his family lived close to Al Capone's, and he was close to his cousin's friends from several gangs. Nitti also lacked a stable family. He was at spars with his stepfather. His teenage sister married a man a decade her senior, and Nitti moved from one odd job to another. The close-knit family system of the gang, its promise of thrill, and the appeal of money obviously lured the adolescent to the gang. It was under his reign that the gang diversified its operations from bootlegging in smaller cities to extortion of Hollywood bigwigs. Bioff was the FBI informant whose testimony had led to Nitti's ill-fated end. But Willie was not always a mole. In fact, he had worked closely under and with Nitti, rising through the ranks to become one of his closest aides. There was an obvious friendship between the two. Like Nitti, Bioff had had a tough family life. He was kicked out by his father at the age of 8 and had quickly fallen into a life of crime. In Hollywood, he had gold business cards and wore flashy suits. He was much easier to catch under the glare of the spotlight. When he was indicted, Willie learned that his loyalty was actually quite brittle. He agreed to testify against the top management of the outfits in return for a reduced sentence. His friends went to jail, Nitti died of suicide, and upon his release, William moved to Arizona and assumed a new identity. He got close to a senator there, started a business with the senator's nephew, then left it all to become a casino manager. But the gang never forgets its members, no matter how hard they try to forget the gang. Whoever ordered the hit clearly wanted to make an example out of Bioff. Parts of his body were found scattered across the streets near his house.